In 1897, in the industrial city of Springfield, Massachusetts, a former champion bicycle racer named George M. Hendee founded the Hendee Manufacturing Company to build bicycles under the Indian name, a brand label chosen for its association with speed and Americana rather than any direct corporate claim to indigenous heritage. Hendee had spent the 1880s and early 1890s as one of the most successful competitive cyclists in the country, and his transition into manufacturing reflected a broader pattern among American sporting figures of that era who moved from athletic competition into industrial enterprise. In 1900, Hendee partnered with Oscar Hedstrom, a Swedish-born engineer and former bicycle racer who had been experimenting with small gasoline engines mounted on bicycle frames. The partnership combined Hendee's business acumen and brand instincts with Hedstrom's mechanical engineering skill, a pairing that would define the company's first 3 decades. Hedstrom built the first working prototype at the old Worcester Cycle Manufacturing Company in Middleton, Connecticut, completing the machine on May 25, 1901. The first public demonstration followed within days, on Cross Street in Springfield, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers who watched the diamond-framed machine climb a hill that had reportedly defeated earlier motorized bicycles. The company's first factory opened in downtown Springfield that same year, beginning a relationship between the city and the brand that would last, with interruptions, for more than a century. 2 production units followed the prototype before the end of 1901, and the first machines reached paying customers in 1902. The timing placed Indian among the earliest commercially viable motorcycle manufacturers in the United States, arriving years before many of the names that would later become household brands. This origin establishes the foundation for what would become one of the most consequential American transportation companies of the 20th century, one whose technical and cultural influence would extend well beyond the relatively narrow category of 2-wheeled vehicles. The earliest Indian motorcycles were simple by later standards, built around single-cylinder engines mounted within modified bicycle frames, but they introduced features that addressed real problems faced by early riders on unpaved, rutted American roads. Hedstrom's engineering choices prioritized reliability and rideability over raw power, a strategy that helped the machines establish a reputation distinct from some of the more temperamental European designs being imported at the time. Indian's chain drive system, rather than the belt drives common among competitors, offered more consistent power transfer and required less frequent adjustment, a practical advantage for owners who rode their machines on a daily basis rather than for occasional recreation. Word of the company's reliability spread through cycling clubs and trade publications, and demand grew steadily through the middle of the decade. Sales figures from this period are not always consistently documented across surviving company records and secondary sources, and some specific production numbers for individual years remain disputed among historians, but the overall trajectory was one of rapid expansion. By 1903, Hedstrom himself had set a world motorcycle speed record of 56 miles per hour, a publicity feat that reinforced the brand's association with speed and mechanical sophistication. The achievement was widely reported in cycling and early automotive press, lending the company credibility at a moment when motorized transportation was still viewed with considerable public skepticism. Indian used these early competitive successes deliberately, recognizing that demonstrated performance on the track translated into consumer confidence on the street. This relationship between racing achievement and commercial credibility would become a recurring pattern throughout the company's history, repeated across multiple distinct eras of competition and revival. The most significant engineering development of Indian's first decade arrived in 1905, when the company introduced its first V-twin engine, a 42-degree configuration displacing approximately 39 cubic inches. The V-twin was initially built for factory racing applications, but its advantages in power delivery and smoother operation led to a production version intended for general use within a few years. According to most automotive historians, this made Indian the first American manufacturer to commercialize a V-twin motorcycle engine, predating Harley-Davidson's adoption of the same configuration by several years, although exact priority claims of this kind are occasionally contested in enthusiast circles and should be understood as the generally accepted account rather than an uncontested fact. The V-twin format would go on to define American motorcycle design for the rest of the 20th century and beyond, shaping not only Indian's own product line, but that of its principal domestic competitor and much of the industry that followed. Annual production climbed substantially during this period, reportedly exceeding 500 units annually in the early years of the decade and continuing to rise as the decade progressed. Indian's engineering team introduced a sequence of mechanical refinements throughout these years, including a twist-grip throttle control, an early mechanical oil pump for engine lubrication, and electric lighting systems that reduced rider dependence on acetylene lamps. In 1908, the company adopted magneto-ignition, replacing the failure-prone battery and jump spark timer systems that had frustrated early motorcyclists industry-wide. These were not isolated novelties. Together, they represented a systematic effort to make motorcycling more dependable and more attractive to ordinary consumers rather than only to mechanically inclined enthusiasts. The 1910 model year brought a leaf spring front fork and refined oiling systems, improvements aimed squarely at the rough, frequently unpaved roads that characterized most of the American transportation network at the time. By the early 1910s, Indian had established itself as a technical leader in an industry still defining its own engineering conventions. Indian's production reached a historic peak in 1913 when the company manufactured an estimated 32,000 motorcycles, a figure that made it, by most accounts, the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world at that time. This scale of output reflected both strong consumer demand and the company's investments in manufacturing capacity at its Springfield facilities, which had grown considerably since the modest beginnings of 1901. The same year, Indian introduced a swinging arm rear suspension working against leaf springs, a refinement that further improved ride quality on the era's poor road surfaces, building on the leaf spring front fork the company had introduced 3 years earlier. The Springfield Works expanded its workforce substantially to support this volume of output, and the surrounding city came to be associated nationally with motorcycle manufacturing, in much the way Detroit had already become associated with automobiles. Company management viewed 1913 as confirmation that motorized two-wheeled transportation had moved decisively from novelty to mainstream consumer product, a judgment the broader market would largely vindicate over the following decade. Indian's position as production leader in this era represented the high watermark of its first corporate generation, a peak from which the company's path would prove considerably less linear in the decades that followed. Indian's competitive racing program flourished alongside its commercial growth during these same years, with company-sponsored riders competing in board track racing, a popular and often dangerous form of motorsport conducted on steeply banked wooden ovals built specifically for high-speed motorcycle and automobile competition. Indian riders secured numerous victories during this period, and the company's marketing made consistent use of these competitive results to reinforce claims of mechanical superiority over rival machines. The board track era produced enormous public interest in motorcycle racing, drawing large paying crowds and substantial press coverage, and Indian's participation placed the brand at the center of a genuinely popular American spectator sport during the years immediately preceding the First World War. The discipline was hazardous by any standard, with splintered wooden surfaces and minimal protective equipment for riders, and fatalities among both competitors and spectators were not uncommon, a fact that contemporary newspaper coverage did not shy away from reporting, even as the sport's popularity continued to grow. This period also saw growing competition from other domestic manufacturers, most notably Harley-Davidson, which had been founded in Milwaukee in 1903 and was beginning to challenge Indian's market position both on the track and in dealer showrooms. The rivalry between the two companies would persist in various forms for the remainder of the century, shaping product development, marketing strategy, and ultimately the fortunes of both firms across multiple subsequent generations of ownership and leadership. In 1923, the company formally adopted Indian as its corporate name, changing its legal identity from the Hendee Manufacturing Company to the Indian Motorcycle Company, deliberately spelling the word without the letter R in a stylistic choice the company maintained for decades on its corporate documents and signage. The renaming formalized a brand identity that had effectively existed in the marketplace since the company's earliest years, when the Indian name had already been used on bicycles and early motorized models. Alongside the renaming, the company developed and popularized a distinctive headdress emblem, a stylized profile depicting a feathered Native American war bonnet, which appeared on tanks, lighting elements, and promotional materials. This imagery drew directly on Native American iconography, without direct licensing or formal relationship with Native American communities or governing bodies, a commercial practice that was not unusual for American consumer brands of the period, but that would attract sustained criticism in later decades as public understanding of cultural appropriation evolved. The headdress emblem, along with the company's Indian wordmark, became among the most recognizable trademarks in American industrial branding, eventually registered formally and held across different corporate eras by successive owners of the Indian name. Native American advocacy organizations and individual community members have, in subsequent decades, raised concerns about the use of this imagery as a commercial mascot, arguing that it reduces complex and diverse indigenous cultures to a decorative motif disconnected from any genuine partnership or representation. Other voices within Native American communities have expressed more ambivalent or accepting views toward the brand, some citing personal affinity for the machines themselves or viewing the imagery as a form of nostalgic Americana rather than active harm. The historical record reflects this division of opinion rather than a single settled consensus, and the company itself has never fully or publicly resolved the tension surrounding its name and emblem. This duality between celebrated industrial achievement and an unresolved question of cultural representation runs through the entire history of the brand and resists simple characterization in either direction. The outbreak of the First World War placed substantial new demands on Indians' manufacturing capacity, as the United States military sought reliable, fast vehicles capable of carrying messengers and supplies across camps, supply roads, and areas near the front lines in France. Indian committed the overwhelming majority of its production to the war effort, manufacturing close to 50,000 machines for military use, most of them based on the company's existing PowerPlus platform, a larger and more powerful V-twin design introduced shortly before American entry into the conflict. This wartime production commitment carried significant commercial costs on the domestic front, as Indian's civilian dealer network found itself with severely limited inventory to sell to ordinary customers, a shortage that allowed competitors, particularly Harley-Davidson, to gain retail market share during the same years. The decision to prioritize military contracts over civilian sales reflected both patriotic considerations and the practical reality of large, guaranteed government orders during a period of national mobilization, but its long-term commercial consequences for Indian's competitive position have been debated by historians studying the company's later struggles. Indian motorcycles served in a variety of roles during the conflict, including dispatch riding, reconnaissance, and general transport duties, often operating in difficult terrain under combat conditions for which they had not originally been designed. Surviving accounts from the period describe the machines as durable under demanding circumstances, though detailed performance comparisons against the era's other military motorcycles remain a topic civilian historians continue to examine. The war years thus mark an early instance of a recurring theme in Indian's history, in which the company's fortunes became closely tied to American military demand, for better and for worse, across multiple subsequent conflicts. The pattern established during this period of wartime production strength, followed by complicated post-war market repositioning, would repeat itself with even greater consequence 2 decades later. The 1920s brought two of the most enduring model names in the company's history, the Scout and the Chief, both introduced toward the middle of the decade and both destined to outlive their original corporate parent by many decades through later revivals. The Scout, introduced in 1920, was a smaller, lighter V-twin aimed at riders who wanted nimble handling and accessible performance rather than the larger touring-oriented machines that had characterized much of Indian's prior lineup. The Chief followed in 1922, built around a larger, more powerful V-twin platform intended for serious touring and sustained highway use, and it would eventually become the company's flagship model across several distinct corporate eras. Both platforms underwent continuous engineering refinement throughout the decade, incorporating improved frames, updated valve designs, and the company's ongoing investments in suspension and braking technology. Indian's touring-oriented marketing during this period emphasized comfort, durability, and the romance of long-distance American travel, themes that resonated with a growing national culture of road trips and cross-country exploration enabled by improving highway infrastructure. The company maintained an extensive dealer network across the country during these years, supporting both retail sales and the touring lifestyle the brand increasingly promoted in its advertising. Racing remained an important part of company strategy, with Scout and Chief-based machines competing in increasingly organized national racing series that were beginning to formalize what had previously been a looser patchwork of regional events. The decade closed, however, on a note of economic catastrophe that would reshape the entire American economy, and with it, the fortunes of every domestic motorcycle manufacturer, Indian included. The Scout's lightweight and forgiving handling characteristics also made it the preferred machine for an unusual form of American carnival entertainment that emerged during these years, the Motordrome, more commonly known as the Wall of Death, in which riders circled a vertical-walled wooden cylinder at speed, held against the surface by centrifugal force alone, while paying crowds watched from a railed platform above. This stunt-riding tradition had originated earlier in the century at venues including Coney Island in New York, but it expanded considerably during the 1920s and 1930s as traveling carnivals and state fairs incorporated motordrome acts into their attractions across the country. Indian Scouts became closely associated with this form of entertainment because of their manageable size, reliable low-speed torque, and structural durability under the sustained centrifugal loads the maneuver imposed on a motorcycle's frame and wheels. The spectacle offered ordinary Americans, many of whom had never ridden a motorcycle themselves, a vivid and memorable public demonstration of what the machines were mechanically capable of, reinforcing brand familiarity well beyond Indian's existing customer base of owners and racing enthusiasts. Some Wall of Death performers continued to use Indian Scout-based machines for decades afterward, and the model's later commercial reissue by the company's modern ownership made direct reference to this stunt-riding heritage in its marketing materials. This intersection of carnival entertainment and brand visibility represents one of the more distinctive, if less frequently documented, channels through which Indian motorcycles entered American popular culture during the interwar period, operating alongside more conventional avenues such as racing results and dealer advertising. The Great Depression devastated discretionary consumer spending across the United States, and motorcycles, often viewed as recreational rather than essential purchases, suffered disproportionately as household budgets contracted. Indian sales fell sharply during the early 1930s, and the company underwent significant financial restructuring to survive the period, including changes in ownership and management that brought new capital and new strategic direction. E. Paul DuPont, a member of the prominent DuPont industrial family, acquired a controlling interest in the company during this period, bringing both financial resources and managerial stability at a moment when many smaller manufacturers were disappearing entirely from the American motorcycle market. Under DuPont's ownership, Indian consolidated its model lineup, focusing resources on the Scout and Chief platforms while discontinuing several less commercially successful lines, a rationalization strategy common among manufacturers attempting to survive the economic contraction of the decade. The company also introduced new colors, streamlined styling elements, and design refinements during these years, attempting to maintain consumer interest despite the constrained market. Some specific financial figures from this period of Indian's history are not consistently documented across surviving records, and precise sales totals for individual Depression-era years should be treated with appropriate caution rather than stated as definitive. By the middle of the decade, the company had stabilized sufficiently to resume modest growth, aided by a slowly recovering national economy and continued brand loyalty among existing Indian owners. The survival of the company through the Depression, while several smaller American motorcycle manufacturers ceased operations permanently during the same years, demonstrated both the underlying strength of the Indian brand and the importance of the capital and management changes introduced during this difficult interval. The Second World War again transformed Indian's manufacturing priorities, beginning even before formal American entry into the conflict, as the company supplied motorcycles to the French government in the years preceding the fall of France in 1940. Following American entry into the war, Indian became a significant military contractor, producing the Model 741, a mid-size machine supplied in substantial numbers to Allied forces, alongside other military variants developed specifically for wartime conditions, such as dispatch riding, convoy escort, and sidecar-mounted equipment transport. Across the full span of the war, Indian delivered motorcycles and spare parts to military customers valued at approximately $24 million, according to figures commonly cited in historical accounts of the company's wartime activity, though exact accounting methods behind this figure are not always specified in available sources. Military production again constrained the availability of civilian models throughout the war years, repeating the dynamic the company had experienced a generation earlier during the First World War, and dealers once again found themselves managing customer demand with severely limited retail inventory. Government contracts of this scale provided crucial revenue stability for Indian at a moment when civilian discretionary spending on motorcycles had effectively disappeared, a financial lifeline comparable in importance to the company's First World War military production 2 decades earlier. The company's most technically distinctive wartime contribution was the Indian 841, a motorcycle engineered specifically for desert warfare and built around a longitudinally mounted, air-cooled 90-degree V-twin engine paired with a shaft drive to the rear wheel, a configuration that departed sharply from Indian's traditional chain-drive, transverse V-twin architecture. This drivetrain layout anticipated design choices that would later be popularized by other manufacturers, including the Italian firm Moto Guzzi, in subsequent decades, and it stands as one of the more technically innovative, if commercially limited, chapters in the company's engineering history. The 841 was developed in anticipation of North African desert operations, with engineering emphasis placed on dust tolerance, ground clearance, and a low center of gravity suited to sand and uneven terrain. But the model ultimately saw relatively limited production and was not widely adopted for the specific desert campaigns it had been designed to support. Military planners instead favored other vehicles for many of the roles the 841 had been intended to fill, leaving the design as a notable engineering achievement that did not translate into large-scale operational deployment. The machines built during this period, robust, simply engineered, and produced in large numbers, found their way into the hands of veterans returning home after the war's end, many of whom retained an enthusiasm for motorcycling shaped directly by their wartime experience operating military-spec machines. This veteran-driven enthusiasm contributed to a broader post-war surge in civilian motorcycle interest across the United States, a surge that Indian's subsequent post-war product strategy would prove poorly positioned to fully capture. In the years immediately following the war, Indian's management made a strategic decision that would prove consequential and, in retrospect, deeply controversial among historians of the company. A shift in product focus towards smaller, lighter-weight models intended to broaden the brand's appeal beyond its traditional base of large touring motorcycle enthusiasts. This shift, intended to compete more directly against lightweight imports and to capture a broader consumer base, instead alienated significant portions of Indian's existing customer base, who had built brand loyalty around the large, powerful Chief and Scout platforms developed over the preceding 2 decades. Quality control issues compounded this strategic misstep, as cost-cutting measures introduced during this period of financial pressure reportedly affected the reliability and finish of several model lines, damaging a reputation for dependability that the company had spent decades building. Concurrently, Indian's manufacturing processes had become comparatively costly and inefficient relative to those of its principal domestic rival, which had achieved superior economies of scale through more standardized production methods. Harley-Davidson capitalized on these difficulties, consolidating a dominant position in the American heavyweight motorcycle market that it would not relinquish for the remainder of the century. British manufacturers, including Triumph and BSA, simultaneously gained ground among American consumers seeking lighter, faster machines, intensifying competitive pressure on Indian from multiple directions at once. Ralph B. Rogers became president of the company during this turbulent period, presiding over further changes in product strategy and corporate structure as the company's financial position continued to deteriorate.
The combination of strategic missteps, quality concerns, structural cost disadvantages, and intensifying competition created a downward spiral from which the company would prove unable to recover under its original corporate identity.
Rogers resigned from the presidency in 1950, and English businessman John Brockhouse subsequently assumed a controlling role in the company's affairs, a transition that reflected just how precarious Indian's financial position had become by the start of the new decade. Brockhouse's involvement brought additional capital, but did not reverse the underlying commercial and operational problems that had accumulated over the preceding several years. The company continued to struggle through the early 1950s, attempting various product and marketing adjustments without success in restoring its prior market position or financial stability. By 1953, the situation had become untenable, and the Indian Motorcycle Manufacturing Company ceased domestic production entirely, discontinuing all of its motorcycle models and effectively ending the operating history of the original Springfield-based manufacturer that had begun more than 5 decades earlier. The closure marked one of the more significant industrial failures in American motor vehicle manufacturing history, eliminating what had once been, by production volume, the largest motorcycle company in the world.
Following the cessation of manufacturing, Brockhouse Engineering retained rights to the Indian name and, for a period extending to approximately 1960, marketed imported Royal Enfield motorcycles from England under Indian branding, a practice that allowed the trademark to remain commercially active even as genuine American manufacturing under the name had ended. This arrangement, while keeping the Indian name in circulation, represented a significant departure from the company's founding identity as a manufacturer of its own original engineering, since the machines sold during this period were British designs rebadged for the American market. The end of original production in 1953 left the Indian name as a valuable but orphaned trademark, a condition that would persist with periodic licensing arrangements and short-lived revival attempts for several decades to follow.
The decades following 1953 were marked by a fragmented and often confusing series of ownership changes, licensing arrangements, and small-scale revival attempts, none of which succeeded in re-establishing Indian as a significant manufacturing presence comparable to its pre-war status. Various entities acquired rights to the Indian trademark during this period, in some cases attempting limited production runs, and in other cases primarily holding the name for licensing purposes without substantial manufacturing activity behind it. Legal disputes over trademark ownership arose periodically during these decades, reflecting the complicated and sometimes contested chain of corporate succession that followed the original company's dissolution. For much of this period, the Indian name survived more as a cultural memory and a valuable piece of intellectual property than as an active manufacturing concern, kept alive in public consciousness through vintage motorcycle enthusiasts, museum collections, and continued appearances of original machines at races, rallies, and exhibitions. The persistence of public affection for the brand during these decades, despite the absence of meaningful new production, speaks to the depth of cultural attachment that the original company had established during its half-century of active manufacturing. Several attempted revivals during the 1990s pursued limited production of Indian-branded motorcycles, generally on a small scale and without achieving lasting commercial success or broad market presence. These intermittent efforts demonstrated continued commercial interest in the trademark, even as none of them managed to replicate anything resembling the company's earlier industrial scale. The fragmented decades between the original closure and any genuinely substantial revival illustrate how a brand's cultural value can persist independently of and considerably longer than the corporate entity that originally created it.
A more substantial revival effort began in 2006 when the newly formed Indian Motorcycle Company, then owned largely by Stellican Limited, a London-based private equity firm, relocated operations to Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and resumed production under the Indian name. This iteration of the company built motorcycles in considerably smaller volumes than the original Springfield manufacturer had achieved even during its more modest early years, and the operation never reached a scale capable of seriously challenging established competitors in the American heavyweight motorcycle market. The Kings Mountain venture nonetheless represented a meaningful step in re-establishing genuine manufacturing activity under the Indian name, moving beyond the licensing-only arrangements that had characterized much of the preceding decades. Production during this period focused on updated versions of historically resonant model names, drawing explicitly on the visual and mechanical heritage of the original Chief and other classic Indian designs, an approach that traded on nostalgia and brand recognition rather than radical reinvention. The limited scale of this revival reflected both the capital constraints facing a private equity-backed venture and the broader challenges facing any manufacturer attempting to compete against deeply entrenched incumbents in a mature, brand-loyal market segment.
Industry observers at the time generally regarded the Kings Mountain operation as a meaningful but ultimately insufficient attempt to restore Indian to genuine commercial relevance, lacking the manufacturing infrastructure, distribution network, and capital depth that a full-scale revival would require. The venture's relatively modest footprint set the stage for what would prove to be a considerably more consequential ownership change just a few years later, one that would finally provide the manufacturing scale and corporate resources the brand had lacked since 1953. This transition point between a well-intentioned but constrained boutique revival and a fully resourced industrial relaunch marks a clear dividing line in the brand's modern history.
On April 19, 2011, Polaris Industries, a major American manufacturer of off-road vehicles, snowmobiles, and other recreational products, announced its acquisition of the Indian Motorcycle Company, bringing the brand under the ownership of a financially substantial and operationally experienced parent corporation for the first time since the original company's collapse. Polaris chief executive Scott Wine described the acquisition publicly as an effort to be part of what he characterized as the revitalization of a quintessentially American brand, language that signaled the company's intent to position Indian as a heritage-driven competitor in the heavyweight motorcycle segment. The acquisition consolidated Indian's operations with Polaris's existing manufacturing infrastructure, eventually integrating production with facilities the parent company already operated in Minnesota and Iowa, a significant expansion of manufacturing capacity relative to the Kings Mountain operation it replaced. Polaris also owned the Victory Motorcycles brand at the time of the Indian acquisition, creating an internal question about how the parent company would manage two heritage-oriented motorcycle brands within a single corporate structure, a question that would be resolved definitively several years later.
Beginning in August 2013, Polaris commenced designing, developing, and manufacturing new Indian-branded motorcycle lines under its own engineering and production standards, representing the first instance since 1953 of Indian motorcycles being built with the manufacturing scale, quality control systems, and capital investment of a major industrial corporation. The new product lineup drew heavily on historic model names, reintroducing the Chief and Scout designations alongside newly developed models such as the Roadmaster, each updated with modern engineering, electronics, and materials while retaining visual and stylistic connections to the brand's pre-war heritage. This combination of historic naming conventions and thoroughly modern engineering proved commercially effective, allowing Polaris to market genuine heritage credibility alongside contemporary performance and reliability standards that the original Indian Motorcycle Company, in its final declining years, had struggled to maintain. The 2011 acquisition thus represents the clearest turning point in the brand's century-long history, the moment at which Indian transitioned from a marginal, intermittently active trademark into a genuinely competitive industrial manufacturer once again.
The years following the 2011 acquisition saw a sustained and measurable expansion of Indian's market presence under Polaris ownership, with global registration figures rising from just over 4,000 units in 2012 to a reported record of approximately 34,477 motorcycles in 2021, according to figures commonly cited in industry coverage of the brand's growth trajectory. This expansion required substantial ongoing investment in manufacturing capacity, dealer network development, and product engineering, resources that reflected the financial depth Polaris brought to the brand relative to its more constrained predecessor ownership structures. In 2017, Polaris made the strategic decision to discontinue its Victory Motorcycles brand entirely, consolidating the company's heritage cruiser and touring motorcycle ambitions exclusively under the Indian name,
a decision that simplified Polaris's internal brand portfolio while signaling the company's confidence in Indian's long-term commercial prospects. This consolidation allowed Polaris to concentrate engineering, marketing, and dealer resources on a single heritage brand rather than dividing them between two competing internal product lines, a structural efficiency that contributed to Indian's subsequent growth.
The company's design center in Bergdorf, Switzerland, contributed to ongoing product development during this period, reflecting the increasingly international character of the brand's engineering operations, even as its manufacturing and historical identity remained firmly rooted in the American Midwest and Indian's New England origins. Racing once again became a significant part of company strategy during the Polaris era, with Indian-sponsored teams competing in flat track and other motorsport disciplines, deliberately echoing the competitive heritage that had defined the brand's earliest decades. Marketing throughout this period leaned heavily on themes of American manufacturing heritage, mechanical authenticity, and continuity with the brand's pre-1953 identity, a strategy made credible by the genuine engineering and manufacturing investment Polaris had committed to the brand. By the early 2020s, Indian had re-established itself as a legitimate competitor in the American heavyweight motorcycle market for the first time in roughly 70 years, a recovery that would have seemed implausible to observers surveying the brand's fragmented, licensing-dependent existence during the preceding half-century.
Throughout this period of renewed commercial success, the brand's name and its associated headdress imagery continued to attract scrutiny and criticism regarding the use of Native American iconography for commercial purposes. Critics, including representatives of indigenous motorcycle clubs and cultural advocacy organizations, have argued that the continued use of Indian, chief, and chieftain as product names, alongside the feathered headdress emblem, amounts to treating indigenous identity and imagery as a commercial mascot, disconnected from any genuine relationship with Native American communities or governance structures. Some commentators have drawn comparisons between this criticism and broader public debates surrounding the use of indigenous imagery in American sports team branding during the same general period, debates that prompted several other organizations to retire or substantially revise similar iconography. Polaris, during its ownership period, maintained the Indian name and a somewhat reduced emphasis on the headdress imagery relative to some earlier corporate eras, though the company has not, as of available public information, fully discontinued the use of Native American-derived branding elements or issued a comprehensive public response directly addressing the criticism in detail.
Opinion within Native American communities on this question has remained genuinely divided rather than uniform, with some individuals and organizations expressing strong objection to the branding, and others, including some Native American motorcycle owners, expressing personal affinity for the machines, or viewing the imagery as connected to a broader American nostalgia, rather than as an active harm requiring correction. This division of opinion does not resolve the underlying question, and the historical record available to researchers does not support a definitive claim that the controversy has been settled in either direction. The persistence of this unresolved tension across more than a century of the brand's existence, spanning multiple distinct corporate owners and several entirely different generations of American cultural attitudes toward indigenous representation, illustrates how commercial branding decisions made in one era can generate ongoing ethical questions that later corporate owners must navigate without fully resolving. Any comprehensive account of Indian Motorcycle's legacy must acknowledge this dimension of the brand's history, alongside its undeniable industrial and engineering achievements, without treating either dimension as canceling out the other. The most recent major transformation in Indian's corporate history occurred in early 2026, when Polaris completed the separation of Indian Motorcycle into a standalone company and sold a majority stake in the newly independent business to Carolwood LP, an independent private equity firm headquartered in Los Angeles and founded in 2014. The transaction closed on February 2, 2026, formally ending Polaris's 15-year ownership period and establishing Indian Motorcycle as a fully independent business for the first time since the original Springfield company's dissolution in 1953. Mike Kennedy was named chief executive of the new standalone company, and approximately 900 employees transitioned into the newly independent organization, retaining the substantial majority of the engineering, design, and manufacturing personnel who had built the brand's modern product lineup during the Polaris era. Manufacturing facilities in Spirit Lake, Iowa, and Monticello, Minnesota, along with the Industrial Design and Technology Center in Bergdorf, Switzerland, transferred to the new company as part of the separation, preserving the manufacturing and engineering infrastructure that had taken more than a decade to build under Polaris ownership.
Polaris executives publicly framed the separation as a means of sharpening the parent company's strategic focus on its off-road and snowmobile businesses, while presenting the move as creating immediate value for shareholders of both the parent corporation and the newly independent motorcycle company. The long-term commercial implications of full independence under private equity ownership remain, as of this account, a matter that will only become clear with time. And any assessment of how this most recent transition will affect product development, manufacturing investment, or market position should be treated as provisional rather than settled. Whatever the outcome of this latest chapter, Indian Motorcycle's documented history already spans more than a century of American industrial activity, encompassing genuine engineering innovation, 2 world wars of military production, a complete corporate collapse, decades of fragmented dormancy, a measured boutique revival, a fully resourced industrial relaunch under a major American manufacturer, and now a return to independent private ownership.
Few American consumer brands have traveled a path this discontinuous while retaining enough underlying cultural and commercial value to be repeatedly worth reviving, a pattern that speaks to something durable in the relationship between the Indian name and American conceptions of mechanical craftsmanship, road travel, and industrial heritage, even as the unresolved questions surrounding its name and imagery continue to accompany that legacy into its second century.